He is an anthropologist, author, and a fellow of Royal Society of Arts. He has taught at the London School of Economics, the University of Virginia, and Goldsmiths, University of London. He serves on the Labour Party Task Force on International Development, works as a policy director for the Rules Collective, sits on the executive board of Academic Stands Against Poverty, ASAP, and recently joined the International Editorial Advisory Board of Third World Quarterly. So, please welcome Dr. Jason Hickel.
Hello. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. It's really an honor, and what a glorious room. It's my first time in Bergen, and it's a fantastic city, and I'm very excited to be here. So I apologize. My Norwegian is not very good, so I'm going to speak in English. If I speak too quickly, then just wave your hands wildly. I can see over here. So I want to start today with this image. Can I just see a raise of hands from the room? Who's seen this before? The Planetary Boundaries Framework. Some. This is probably the most important piece of ecological research that's been published in the past few decades. And what it does is it gives us basically a snapshot of where our planet is at right now with respect to ecological limits. And what we see is we see dramatic overshoots in everything from climate change, most obviously, but also species extinction rates, biogeochemical flows from industrial agriculture, which pollute our streams and create dead zones in the oceans, land system change due to deforestation and intensive soil degradation. So everywhere where you see yellow, that's where we're overshooting planetary boundaries on a number of critical processes. Everywhere you see red is where we're in potentially catastrophic tipping point space. Now, if I was to reduce this idea of our ecological impacts down to a single indicator, it would be this, the material footprint of nations, which is commonly used by ecologists. What it does is it adds up everything that nations consume, everything from fish to food, to biomass, to timber, to gold, to silver, everything. And what we see is that since about 1998, humanity has been dramatically overshooting what ecologists say is the safe level of material consumption. And this creates negative ecological impacts around the world. Now, what's interesting is that rising material consumption, and now you can see the red line is the boundary. You can see we're overshooting what ecologists say is safe levels by about 40% per year. 85 billion tons of material stuff consumed. Material consumption is very tightly linked to GDP growth. And so, which is what I show in the second graph here, those two lines. And so it's not surprising that the vast majority of our ecological overshoot as a planet is being driven by a few high-income rich countries. So what happens if we plot it like this? This is just for some background. What we see is that high-income nations, which are on the far right here, are consuming in the region of 28 material tons of stuff per person per year, which is extraordinary and 4 times higher than the planetary safe level. Lower middle income people are consuming in the region of 2 to 3 tons per year. If we were all to consume like the average person in the rest of the world, we would have no ecological overshoot. If the rest of the world was to consume like high-income people, like people in the UK and in Norway, we would need the equivalent of 4 planets to sustain our consumption. Now keep this in mind because that is what the mainstream development narrative tells us we need to pursue this level of consumption that high-income nations have. It is ludicrous and suicidal. I want you to keep that in mind just as backgrounds. It will become clear later on. Let's move to climate change, though, which is obviously the one that everyone is focused on and what we're talking about today. The orange line here indicates our level of emissions at business as usual. And what you see is that estimated temperature rise will be about 4.2 degrees Celsius of global warming by the end of the century. Okay? Now, you may think that the Paris Agreement has solved this problem. The Paris Agreement, which is a voluntary agreement that relies on voluntary national contributions to emissions reductions, is the blue line. What you see is that projected into 2100, there's no reduction of emissions whatsoever on an annual basis. Right. Why is that? The reason is because our projected economic growth each year is outstripping promised gains in decarbonization. Okay? So we're fighting an uphill battle, and we are losing. What we actually need to be doing is hitting something like the 1.5 and 2 degree pathways, which you see at the bottom here. Now keep in mind, 3.3 degrees Celsius, which is what we are presently headed toward, assuming everyone follows through with the Paris agreements, is nothing short of catastrophic. Okay? That is a planet that we cannot imagine living on. It will cause mass famine, mass human displacements, and it is not ultimately compatible with global civilization as we know it. So I want to zoom in on what the IPCC report from a couple of months ago has said. And I'm sure you've seen this graph. On the left is our historical emissions. On the right is what we need to achieve by the middle of the century, 2045, roughly. I want to emphasize, it's impossible to overstate how radical and dramatic this transformation needs to be. This is a complete reversal of our existing trajectory as a civilization. Okay? This requires all hands on deck, a total reconstitution of our energy system, which has been built up as fossil fuels for over 200 years, now needs to be completely reorganized in 30. It's impossible to overstate the scale of this challenge. So here's the question. Can we do this? Well, theoretically, yes, and that's good news. And we need a few things. We need rapid rollout of renewable energy, specifically solar and wind, which is technology we already have. We can't wait for new innovations to come down the line. We have to roll out solar and winds to eliminate emissions from fossil fuels. We need reforestation and soil regeneration on farms to eliminate emissions from land use. And we need to switch to next-generation industrial processes to eliminate emissions that come from the production of cement and steel and plastic. Okay? Now, and we need to do this with massive public investments. High subsidies on renewables, high carbon taxes, much higher than anything Europe has right now, in the region of $300 to $3,000 per ton, and government orders that transform plants that are presently producing things like cars and refrigerators into producing things like wind turbines and solar panels. Okay? Similar to what the kind of mobilization we had during World War II. And this is what people call a Green New Deal. We absolutely need to have something like this. But here's the question. Can we accomplish this while still at the same time growing the global economy at existing rates? And remember, the idea of growth is baked into the Sustainable Development Goals. Right in the center, in SDG 8, there's a call to expand global GDP by 3% per year, okay, existing rates. Now, that might seem not very much as an increment. We're used to hearing such a figure. But in fact, because of the exponential nature of economic growth, it drives rapid expansion. So by the middle of the century, our global economy will have expanded to 3 times its present size at existing rates, almost 3 times its present size. 3 times more extraction and production and consumption than we are already doing. Imagine that on a planet that is already reeling beneath the impacts of human economic action. So the question is, can we decarbonize the entire global economy by 2050 while at the same time tripling its size? Now, it's difficult enough to decarbonize our existing global economy. We are nowhere close to being able to do that already. It's impossible to imagine doing it 3 times over in the limited time that we have available. Why would we make our task so difficult when we know that GDP growth in places like rich nations is no longer necessary? Okay? Now, what's interesting is that to answer this question, all of the existing empirical data that we have, and I've spent years reviewing this literature, says that the answer is no. It's not possible to achieve this feat feasibly, even with the most optimistic policy conditions. Okay? And I won't bore you with the data. Now, you might imagine, why aren't policymakers freaking out about this? It's obviously a catastrophe. Well, the answer is that for many years now, they've been relying on what we call negative emissions technologies, which are highly speculative. And even the IPCC reports, up until recently, relied on these technologies, and specifically one called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or BECCS. Who here has heard of BECCS before? This is baked into most of the scenarios of the IPCC reports. And what it does is it says, let's grow massive tree plantations around the world, let the trees suck carbon out of the atmosphere, cut the trees down, turn them into pellets, burn them in power stations for energy, capture the emissions that come from the smokestacks, and store them deep underground. Voila, net negative emissions. And the idea here is that we can use this speculative technology to suck carbon out of the atmosphere later on in the century, allowing us to pollute more now. Okay? So we can continue growing as long as we come up with a solution in the future. The yellow in this graph is the amount of emissions that the IPCC typically assumes negative emission technologies will be able to suck out. It's extraordinary. And they come up with this answer simply because they began from the assumption that we have to have continuing economic growth at all costs. And so our climate change agenda has to fit within that model. Okay? But the scientific consensus now strongly rejects BECCS, and this is coming from scientists across the board who work on this issue. They point out that the technology doesn't exist. Even if it did exist, there's no way we could scale it in time to save us. And even if we could, it would take up land more than 3 times the size of India, which would, of course, be grabbed from the global south, drive poor farmers off their lands, contribute to further biosphere degradation, and biodiversity collapse and so on, violating other sustainable development goals like hunger and rates of species extinction. So it's not feasible. And what's interesting is that the IPCC has for the first time now listened. And in their most recent reports, they present a scenario that does not rely on BECCS. And they consider it to be the most feasible existing scenario that the IPCC has devised. Okay? This is what it looks like. As you'll see, there's no yellow here. The red negative emissions is simply from reforestation. Okay? So how do they do this? How do they manage to accomplish this feat of staying under 1.5 degrees Celsius? Well, the answer is this. And this is the exciting research I want to tell you about today. They assumed that we can scale down material production and consumption starting with high-consuming rich nations, like Norway, like the UK. Okay? Now, what this does is it shrinks total global energy demands, thereby making it much easier for us to accomplish the renewable energy transition. Okay? When we have less energy that we need to transition, it's much easier for us to do it, making it much more likely that we can accomplish our climate goals. Now, the good news is this. We know that we can reduce material production and consumption, while at the same time improving human well-being and social indicators. We have lots of data on this already, which I won't go into now. But there are plenty of countries that have low levels of consumption and very high levels of human well-being. So this is crucial. When it comes to reducing consumption, this is not just about changing individual behavior. Of course, you must fly less. Of course, you must compost your food waste and so on. But that's not going to be enough because we live in an economic system that is designed for perpetual growth. It needs it, and we become its victims, and so too does the planet. So this is about designing a new economic system for the 21st century, one that does not require endless economic growth in order to flourish. So here's the question. What does a post-growth economy look like then? Fortunately, we have lots of research to describe what this looks like. I'm going to give you 4 ideas before I walk off the stage. The first is this. Get rid of GDP and replace it with other measures of progress. GDP is a horrible measure of economic progress. Even the designers of the indicator themselves said never use it for normal, everyday assessment of the economy. Okay? And yet we do. It is the primary directive of virtually every government on this planet. The problem with GDP is that it counts what we turn from nature into money, but does not count the costs of that, does not count the costs of losing a forest as a sink for carbon or as a home for biodiversity. It just counts the gains from selling it on the market for IKEA. Okay? But we can get rid of GDP and replace it with more sensible measures that do account for costs, or simply focus on things that we actually want. Better jobs, better wages, better healthcare, and better education. We can do those directly without simply assuming that GDP growth is somehow magically going to accomplish those things for us. It doesn't. This is crucial because we need to change Goal 8 of the SDGs, which is what I mentioned before. That needs to be at the core of a post-growth agenda. Step 2 is we need to scale down material production and consumption. Okay. What does this look like? Well, here's one way to do it. You can legislate extended warranties on products like iPhones and washing machines so that they last 3 or 4 times longer by law than they do today. You can introduce a right to repair so that your iPhones can be easily repaired by some guy on the street corner rather than having to go to Apple and pay exorbitant amounts of money. We can liberate public spaces from advertising, freeing ourselves from the psychological pressure to consume unnecessarily. We can ban planned obsolescence so your gadgets aren't designed to die after a year or two. We can ban food waste, as South Korea has done, as France and Italy are beginning to do. We can put high taxes on beef. People shouldn't be eating it. It's an absolute ecological disaster. Or the simple way to do it is we can cap annual resource use, right, and tighten it year on year. Ecologists are already beginning to design policies for how this can be done. And that would virtually change incentives across the economy. Okay. Step 3, a shorter working week. Work less and save the planet. What could be better? So here's the crucial thing we've got to grapple with. As we scale down material production and consumption, that's going to mean reducing aggregate economic activity. Now that's okay. Normally, when that happens, it's bad. People lose their jobs. They can't feed their families. It doesn't have to be that way. We can reduce economic activity and at the same time make sure everyone has a fair share of existing necessary labor. These proposals have been around for almost a century, if you can believe it. We can share necessary labor, make sure everyone has access to livelihoods, and increase wages in order to offset losses with a strong living wage policy. Or to protect small businesses, you can supplement wages with a universal basic income. We know it's easy to do. We know it can be done. There's no reason why we can't. The 4th step, and the final one I'll leave you with, is greater equality. Now, this is interesting because politicians are always telling us, we need to solve our social problems and reduce poverty with more economic growth. For them, growth is a substitute for redistribution. But if that is the case, then we can flip that equation around and say that redistribution is a substitute for growth. Equality is the antidote to the growth imperative. We can achieve our social goals right now without any additional growth at all, simply by sharing what we already have more fairly. And this is absolutely essential. And this is the principle that was not acknowledged in Paris recently, and the Yellow Vests pointed that out. Right? On top of that, we need generous public services and affordable housing, which we can fund again now without additional growth, so that people can access the goods and services they need to thrive and live well without needing high levels of income. Okay? Effectively expanding the commons that we can share is essential to reducing the growth imperative. Now, crucially, this not only makes it much easier and more feasible for us to accomplish our climate targets, and the IPCC says the most feasible way, but also benefits all sorts of other areas of ecological overshoot. It will reduce deforestation, it will reduce overfishing, it will reduce biogeochemical loading from farms, et cetera, et cetera. This is the way that we can not only meet our climate goals, but also scale back our ecological impacts on the living planets that we call home. We know it is possible. We have mounds of research now and models showing what a post-growth economy could look like and how people can thrive in the absence of growth. Okay? We also have a growing scholarly consensus that this is what needs to be done. Just a few months ago, 300 leading academics across Europe united in an open letter to the European Commission asking that they pursue post-growth agendas. There's a strong consensus about this among ecological economists. And better yet, the best part of all, is that people want a post-growth economy. Over and over again, despite claims to the contrary that our politicians make, our surveys show that upwards of 70 to 80% of people that are surveyed in high-income countries recognize on some deep level that growth is destructive to our planet and to the ecosystems that we need, that we do not need high levels of consumption, and that we want an economy that focuses on well-being rather than on growth. People want a change. They know that something is wrong. They know that mass consumption is not generating the life that they want. I'll leave the rest for a different day. I want to leave you with one thought, and that is that people might want to say, oh, a post-growth economy sounds so horrible and austere. On the contrary, the post-growth economy that we imagine is one that is more intimate, more caring, more humane, more just, more exciting, more full of relationships, more full of sharing. There's no question in my mind that we can accomplish it, and we absolutely must organize to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much.